Sing to me, oh Muse. The Odyssey, an original adaptation written and retold for you by Jon Buckeridge. Chapter 1. Endings and Beginnings. Sing to me, O Muse. Tell me the story of a complicated man, a man of many faces. A warrior, a traveller, a genius, a liar, a husband, a father, and a hero? Perhaps. But as we look at him now, he is anything but heroic. He sits on the beach of a tiny island isolated for miles around. Behind him, a stunningly beautiful woman walks back and forth singing softly, but he pays her no mind. He looks out to the sea as it laps against the shore and weeps and sobs and howls. But let's start this story where it deserves to be started, in Troy. For an entire decade, the Trojan War had raged on with almost all the Greek Empire wrapped up in its chaos and destruction. Great heroes and warriors had risen and fallen, and countless lives were lost, but the walls of Troy had still stood strong until Odysseus, king of Ithaca, had an idea. Under his guidance, the Greeks built a vast wooden horse and withdrew their soldiers from the field of battle. The Trojans, seeing the horse as an offering of peace, brought it right inside the city walls and celebrated the whole night long. But within that horse was a force of Greek soldiers who snuck out in the darkness, Odysseus in the lead, and opened the Trojan gates to welcome their brothers in. What followed was brief and brutal. 10 years of pent-up battle fever came flooding out all at once as the Greeks laid waste to one of the most beautiful cities in the world. By morning, Troy was nothing but a smoking ruin. The Greeks celebrated and loaded up their ships with treasure, slaves, and plunder, setting sail to be welcomed home as conquerors. But not Odysseus. For 10 years he had fought in Troy, and for 10 more years he fought to get home. Lost at sea, he travelled through monsters and madness and hell itself. And now he sits on this beach, weeping bitter tears as he stares out across the wine-dark sea. But he was not unnoticed. High on Mount Olympus, where the gods live, to whom we are all but playthings, grey-eyed Athena looked down on him. She had always liked Odysseus. As the goddess of warfare and wisdom, his combination of craftiness and warrior spirit had always appealed to her, and though she would never go so far as to say she was fond of him, he seemed to embody the sort of things she was fond of, and that was sort of the same. Seeing him now, though, she decided enough was enough. She bowed before Zeus, the all-powerful king of the gods. "Father," she said, "I have a request to make. You see Odysseus down there on that island? All he wants in the entire world is to go home to his wife and son, but for the last 7 years he's been trapped there. I think it's time he was set free." Zeus cast a dismissive eye over Odysseus and looked back to Athena. "Mortals," he scoffed. "They get themselves in these difficulties, then have the nerve to blame us for their problems. He's with the nymph Calypso, isn't he? She's beautiful and powerful, a goddess, and will provide all he'll ever need. What's he got to complain about?" "But he doesn't want to be with Calypso, my lord father," replied Athena. "She's holding him against his will."
"Will," snorted the thunder god. "What will have mortals when it comes to the gods? We want them, we claim them. No, I shan't be lifting a finger to—"
"He does always honour the gods richly, father," said Athena, changing tack. It wasn't wise to interrupt the king of the gods, but Athena had done it now, so she pushed on regardless. "Offerings and praise and worship. When Troy was sacked, do you recall how many sacrifices he made to you? More than double what the rest of the Greeks made, and most of them are sleeping safely in their beds now, but not Odysseus." Zeus regarded his daughter sternly. His golden eyes met her grey ones, and he saw a spark in them that he rather liked.
"I know what you're doing, daughter. Don't think you can win me over with talk of offerings. I have quite enough, as well you know. Besides, he angered my brother, and Poseidon is one to hold a grudge."
But he was stroking his beard now, and a tiny spark of pleasure and recollection was kindling in his shining eyes. Athena could see it, if only she could stoke it to a flame. The gods love a gamble. Lord Poseidon is indeed slow to forgiveness, but surely not even he could complain if we give Odysseus a fighting chance, pointed him off in the right direction.
"Ha!" Zeus's laugh cracked out like thunder. "That just tells me how little you know Poseidon. But perhaps this is a grudge it's time he let go of." "Very well."
Athena let go a sigh of relief. "Thank you, father. I am, as ever, eternally grateful."
"Ha!" Zeus sparked to laugh again. "I know that look on your face. You're barely done placing your pieces on the board. No doubt you have more machinations marshalling in your mind."
Athena's grey eyes were a peaceful, placid lake, all serene, and yet deep and impenetrable. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, father. But as it happens, I do feel a trip to Odysseus's home is in order, just to be certain all is ready for his return." She bowed again, and stepped gracefully down from Olympus towards the island of Ithaca. Let's travel with her now to Ithaca. The collection of islands was the heart of Odysseus's kingdom, and Odysseus loved it dearly. Here he had married his wonderful wife Penelope, and soon after their son Telemachus had been born, and Odysseus and his little family looked forward to a long, prosperous life ruling the kingdom together. But then the war had been called, and Odysseus had been called with it. "Don't worry," he told his wife. "I'll be back before New Year." So Penelope and their baby son were left on the island to watch as Odysseus and his fleet of ships sailed off into the sunrise. For the first few years they'd kept busy. Telemachus was learning to walk, Telemachus was learning to talk, and there was always work to be done. But as the war drew on, the tension got worse. Every day they scanned the horizon for any sign of black-hulled ships, but none came. Finally, after 10 years of waiting, news arrived. The war was over. The men were coming home. Odysseus was the hero who had ended it all. Penelope's heart soared. She picked up Telemachus and span him round in her arms till the little boy squealed with laughter. "Your father's coming home, Telemachus. He's finally coming home. Oh, we have so much to prepare." She was so lost in her excitement that she almost missed it when a little voice piped up. "Do you think," asked Telemachus, "do you think my father will like me?" Penelope looked her son right in the eyes and smiled with all the warmth in her heart. "My wonderful son, I'm sure your father will love you." "Oh, good," said Telemachus, "but I think I'll go and tidy my room just to make sure." And with that he wriggled out of her arms and ran off ahead of her. Penelope followed him with her eyes, smiling fondly. Odysseus had missed so much. Telemachus was almost 10 years old now, and he was more like his father every day. But now Odysseus could make up for lost time. Now he'd be able to teach him how to be a man, how to be a warrior, how to be a king. Over the next year, news came in from the neighbouring kingdoms of heroes coming home. But no sign of Odysseus and his men, not yet. After 2 years they still had no sign. 3 years went by, 4 years, 5, then 6, and the hopeful smiles people gave Penelope became smiles of sympathy and commiseration. Then the suitors arrived. It started slowly, a local lord arriving at her home, Odysseus's home, asking for permission to take his place. Then another arrived, and another, and soon there were dozens of them, lords, nobles, and chieftains, all eating in the great hall, pressuring her to pick one of them. For 3 years she had held them off, but she knew she could not do that much longer. Sooner or later, she thought, I will have to make a choice, or the choice will be made for me. And it wasn't just her she had to worry about. In the great hall of Ithaca, Telemachus stood. Growing up, he had always loved this place, with its high ceilings and walls covered in spears and shields. As a boy, he'd loved to stare at them and imagine being a mighty hero slaying monsters. But now he felt like the monsters were all around him, and he was unarmed. He looked around at the writhing mass of men, feasting and drinking in his father's hall, slathering to make it their own. When they had first arrived, Telemachus had enjoyed having the suitors around. He'd been 16, impressionable, eager to learn. But now he was almost 20, and the suitors had spent more than 3 years eating through the wealth of his father's kingdom, and he saw the darker side. He was the prince of Ithaca, and should be king when he came of age. But if one of these suitors should marry his mother and claim the throne of Ithaca for themselves, how quickly would they give that power up? Would they have their own son they wanted to make king instead? They may even decide they were better off without him around at all. He'd heard of it happening. At that moment, his thoughts were interrupted as a new face entered the hall, and Telemachus hurried to greet them. He ran through the melee of suitors, all feasting and drinking. Some laughed and called him errand boy, a few well-placed legs tried to trip him up, and 1 or 2 fists were even thrown in his direction, but Telemachus dodged them all. He was well used to it by now. "Welcome, traveller, to the hall of Odysseus. My name is Telemachus. Come inside. What brings you to Ithaca?"
"Thank you," said the man. "My name is Mentes. I'm an old friend of Odysseus's, travelling by the island. Is he home?"
"My friend," replied Telemachus, "you must not have heard. My father has been missing for 10 years, ever since the end of the war."
"But why then, who are all these men?" the stranger asked. "I assumed it was a feast for his return."
"These men, if they can be called that, are suitors from my mother's hand in marriage. They've been here almost 4 years now, desperate to get hold of the wealth of the throne of Ithaca, if they haven't eaten it all."
Telemachus had assumed he could not be heard over the clamour of the hall, and had not spoken quietly, and one of the suitors turned to address him. "We'll leave when she chooses one of us to be her husband, and not a moment before," said the man. "Now shut up, you trumped-up little lordling, before I come over there and show you the backside of my hand." He hurled a chicken bone at Telemachus. It missed, and hit Mentes instead, and Telemachus saw anger and outrage shine in the traveller's eyes. It was then that he noticed that Mentes' eyes were the most brilliant shade of pure grey, like polished iron. Everything else about him was completely ordinary, except those moon-grey eyes. "That's unusual," thought Telemachus, but then something else caught his attention. He might have imagined it, but he could have sworn that for an instant there was a sort of shimmer in the air around Mentes, like the way the air seems to dance around a sun-baked rock on a hot day. Behind him there was a loud crack. The stool beneath the bone-throwing suitor had given way without warning, depositing the man roughly on his backside to the amusement of the suitors all around him. "That's very unusual," thought Telemachus, but Mentes was saying more.
"These men are rude. They show no respect to you or your household. Why have you not dismissed them and sent them home?"
Telemachus looked around him, at the crowd of men eating his father's wealth and yet still hungry for more. Every now and then they would cast an avaricious eye his way, or turn an ear to listen to his conversation, greedy to hear news that might gain them the advantage over the others. Not one of them was to be trusted. But somehow Telemachus felt he could tell Mentes anything. Pulling him into a quiet corner, Telemachus lowered his voice. "In this hall you see the combined wealth and might of Ithaca and the surrounding nations. Each of these men are from powerful families with huge followings, and here's me and my mother all on our own, and every day we walk a knife edge. None of these suitors will make a move if they think that the whole prize of the kingdom could still be theirs, but if they think that we won't give it to them, what's to stop them from killing us both and dividing the wealth of our house amongst themselves? We are one wrong word away from being murdered in our beds, Mentes, and it's only the grace of the gods that's kept that back that long." Mentes looked at him sadly, and Telemachus felt his eyes sting with tears and his vision went fuzzy. "I'm sorry," he said. "This isn't your burden to carry. No, as much as I hate to say it, the only way these men are leaving is if my father returns, God's willing, or my mother marries one of them, though I don't know where that will leave me."
"And have you no news of your father?" asked Mentes.
"Nothing so far, but I doubt the suitors would let me get to it if there was."
"Well, that's it then, isn't it?"
said Mentes, those grey eyes coming alive with enthusiasm.
"You have to know, don't you? It's no good waiting for news to come to you. You must go looking for it. Look, you don't really know me, but if you'll take my advice, you'll take a ship and go out looking for news of your father. Maybe start in Pylos, speak to old Nestor, they were always friendly. Find out what news there is of him, and then you know what to do. If your father's alive, plan for his return, but if he's dead, then hold a funeral and move on and help your mother pick the best of these suitors. But you just have to know."
Telemachus examined the man.
He had a hard time trusting men. Given most of the men he knew, this was to be expected. But Mentis seemed to talk sense, and it would be good to just be doing something. His eyes flicked to survey the hall of hungry suitors all eager for his throne, and the next step seemed clear. He looked back to Mentis, and paused. Mentis was gone. He'd only looked away for a split second, but somehow Mentis had disappeared. He looked all around the hall, but there was no sign of him. Mentis had, undeniably, vanished. His advice, however, remained, and that night Telemachus followed the man's suggestion. Gathering some loyal friends, he grabbed some supplies, left a note for his mother, and set out across the sea for sign of his father. He just had to know.